Okay, great. Thank you very much. All right, so the talk tonight basically is on security operations. The idea of this being SOAR as a technique that a lot of people are actually looking at now. So some ideas behind how to do that. So a little bit about me. As Aaron Dunn said, I am a SANS senior instructor. At various times in the past, I've taught SEC 401, which is sort of security essentials, SEC 503, which is network intrusion analysis, SEC 504, which is incident handling and hacker techniques, SEC 560, which is network pen testing. I've taught if that's gonna do that, you can keep it a little lower, and I'll just be louder. So SEC 560, which is basically network pen testing. I teach SEC 575, which is mobile device pen testing. And so just lots of different classes. I've taught some the mobile forensics class a couple of times. My career basically started when I was really young. My first job was working in computers when I was 15 years old, running tape backup on Ultrix and VMS systems. I grew up in Massachusetts, so there was this place that was down the street from where I grew up. They basically put out an ad. They needed somebody to come in the afternoon to run tape backup. So that's how I started working in computers. Basically, during that time, I had all sorts of access. I was using systems in a way that basically showed me basic operations. And then as I sort of progressed in my career, I ended up actually doing a lot of operations for large networks. Around 2000, when I was working at Tulane University, I started having to deal with a lot of security type issues. This is when security started becoming an issue for a lot of entities. Basically, in 2000, we didn't have a lot of spam. Right? I implemented a anti-spam system on the university network in order to make it so that, hey, people were reporting that they're having all these spam issues coming in, and we need to do something to filter it. Started having systems compromised, right? And we had, I remember one where it was a mass spectrometer in the chemistry department. It's a Solaris 6 system that had been sitting there. It was connected to the network, right? We had a Class B IPv4 address space. And this computer had been sitting there for a long period of time, and some attackers started using it. And then the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation showed up and said, hey, we saw this computer hacking other computers. You guys need to do something about this. Okay? So this was around 2000, 2001. Started to deal with worms and other things and do incident response on hosts. And at that time, SANS existed. Right, and then I actually started. I need help. I need information. I need to figure out what this is, what this stuff is doing, so that I can get an understanding of how to deal with these problems. Because I really don't know how to deal with these problems. Okay, so that's kind of what I started doing in my work, where I started working in security. Okay, it was around that time frame when security started being an issue. So. My career has been very much of lots of different things, lots of operational type aspects. And the few folks that have been listening to me for the last several days, I have some very strong opinions about how to run things well, right? And a lot of it is just good basic IT operations, and then the distinction of the components of this is normal and this is abnormal. And that this is normal, this is abnormal becomes a tremendously difficult task. So I am not going to talk specifically about how to use a SOAR tool in this talk. What I'm going to talk about here is your rationale for the selection of what things you should prioritize to orchestrate and automate. Because to me, that is just good operations. Now in security, we're usually telling people, you need to do this, you need to do that. But what I've found is that we actually oftentimes don't practice a lot of the things that we try to push onto other people. Okay? And I really want you to think about that and embrace that notion, is all of the things that you're expecting from the IT organization, you should also be exemplifying that yourself in terms of doing excellent operations on your security systems. Okay? So if you have, sort of takeaways or thoughts, there are a couple of ways to contact me after this. My Twitter handle is ccrowmontance. The company that I created, I basically am an independent consultant. I work for myself. It's called Montance. It doesn't mean anything. It's actually, I was looking for a domain, and I had a couple of constraints. It needed to be exactly 8 characters long, right? Because that's sort of the, it needed to be 8 characters, whatever. And then I needed something that was pronounceable, but I also wanted something that didn't actually have any sort of encumbrance associated with it. So I spent a long time doing whois lookups and, sort of like coming up with things and finding other stuff. And I finally found that, Montance. And as far as I knew, at that point, nobody had ever used it. It wasn't a word in English. It wasn't a word in French. It wasn't a word in Spanish, languages that I'm kind of familiar with. Right. So that's my mail domain. So my email address is chris@montance.com. So if you want to talk to me about the stuff that I mentioned tonight, you can get in touch with me that way. You can get in touch with me over email. So that's the introductory stuff. Let me get into it. In terms of orchestration, I'm going to be talking about 2 different terms, so I like to define terms if I'm going to use them. Orchestration is the coordination of multiple systems, right? Typically also employing automation, right? But the idea of orchestration is me taking various disparate parts from different systems and then stitching that together. Automation is technology without human interaction doing processes. Okay? So I would assume that if I asked you, hey, what is automation and what is orchestration, you'd probably come up with definitions pretty close to that already, right? So I don't feel like this is contested territory in terms of talking about this. So in our security operations, I want you to think about all the stuff that you do when you do work. Every single time that you start thinking about doing something. Going forward, I want you to think about the characteristics of what that actually is that you're doing. And so in security operations, I talk about identification, right? And this is, these are just terms that we use, but identification is something might be bad, and I need to inspect that and determine, is this bad or not? I think about investigation. Right, so once I get this initial sort of identification, then I go and do further investigation, make my assessment. I also talk about analysis, the idea of I then take that thing that I'm investigating and pivot out and I find all sorts of information in order to explain the answer to some core questions. Who did this? Why did they do it? What happened? How bad is it? How long has this been going on? Right? Those sorts of questions are part of our analytical investigation. We do response, right? So while I'm spending time looking at something to determine if it is a problem, I also want to be doing other things in order to make it so that that potential problem can't spread. Okay? And we talk about recovery. Now, recovery is an interesting thing. Right? Recovery is the resumption of normal operations. And recovery, a lot of the time, really actually should be a responsibility of the business operations. Recovery entails a bunch of different stuff. Okay? And part of it entails, in my opinion, verifying the data integrity is actually still valid. And if you're a bank, as an example, you'd be really concerned about that. An attacker broke into a system that actually contains transactional information. Are there any transactions inside of there which are not actually valid? And how are you, in the security team, going to actually do that data integrity verification? It's really hard for us, non-experts in data, oftentimes to be able to do that sort of determination. And then, as I'm talking about this, things like recovery, do I want to do that in an automated fashion? Well, of course, the business wants me to do it in an automated fashion. They're like, fix it. There was a problem. You need to fix it. But me actually being able to prepare that sort of stuff for automation is a big challenge. So these sorts of things as you think about what you do for your organization, I want you to start to put them in these buckets mentally. Right? When am I investigating? When am I doing analysis? When am I doing containment? When am I helping in the process of recovery? And ask the question, should I be automating this? Should I have automated it, like in the past, retrospectively? Am I really, did I miss an opportunity 3-6 months ago? But when I'm doing this now, should I also be doing this work in a way that is driving for automation going forward? Okay? And sometimes it's really not worth it to do that, and sometimes it is. So to get you in the mindset of some of the terminology that I'm going to use, when I talk about SOCs, I break it into functional components. You probably don't organize your SOC exactly like this, but your SOC needs to perform all of these functions. Okay? Steering committee, command center, network security monitoring, threat intelligence, incident response, forensics, and self-assessment. Now, you may have outsourced portions of this. You may have, you may have actually set this up where a different team handles incident response. Oh, and by the way, I actually saw someone taking a photo. That's perfectly cool. I don't mind that. But you can also download this entire PDF, and I'll show you the link at the end of the talk. I'm sorry. I actually have it as a PowerPoint. I have the PowerPoint of this, and then I also have an Excel spreadsheet with an extensive process listing that I'll share with you because I reference it in the talk. So that stuff will be available, and I'll share the URL. And again, if you want to take photos, that's fine too. But you don't have to if you want to take notes, because you'll get the entire slide deck. So these different functions, I'm going to explain briefly, because I'm going to talk about the SOC in the context of these functions. Steering committee. Steering committee, in my opinion, is the interface between the SOC, like the people working in it, the people managing it, and the business that is expecting that SOC to protect it. So when I talk about the steering committee, I think the steering committee is comprised of your constituents, and your constituents are the people who you protect. Now, these may be your customers, these may be internal employees, these may be various business units, right? If you're a managed security service provider and running a SOC, you should have a way to interface with your customers to be able to make sure that they are getting the service that they want and need. And the steering committee is really that function. The steering committee I put as part of the SOC, but it's also comprised mostly of people external to the SOC. And the steering committee is where you should be presenting your metrics and showing that you're meeting your service level obligations that you've established with the organization. And this is where the organization can complain to you and say, hey, you're not doing the right sort of job for us. We have problems. We have issues with the way that you're doing it. Okay? This is the interface. And if you do not have a clear picture of how you interface with the rest of the organization or with your constituents, your SOC is going to be doing stuff without the right sort of contextual awareness, and it's going to be inefficient, maybe even tremendously inefficient. Maybe it's going to be interfering with the operations of the business. Okay, so if you don't know what your steering committee is, then you need to clarify that. The command center is what I call the interrupt layer that sits around the SOC. These are the people that answer the phone and sort of help by either receiving information destined for the analyst or answer questions and disseminate information back out. The command center is intended to keep the external people who want stuff from the SOC from bothering the people who are actually doing the work. Right? And there are all sorts of aspects to that. But the command center is the interrupt layer. It's the thing that sits in front and makes sure that the SOC and the rest of these other functions can do what they're supposed to do. I call this function network security monitoring, but it's basically all of the monitoring that happens. Threat intelligence is the notion of study of adversaries, enrichment of internal data, collection of external stuff, and telling the internal people who are doing work what they need to know in a time-relevant basis, as well as studying all of the artifacts that we collect and assess internally and producing threat intelligence that we're retaining for the long term and potentially sharing out to other partners. Okay. Incident response is the intervention with things that might be going bad, minimizing damage. Forensics is the deep dive analysis of artifacts through reverse engineering, memory analysis, file system analysis, network artifacts. Right? This forensic analysis, I want it to be authoritative. I want these people to be experts in their capabilities. Oftentimes this ends up outsourced because it's really hard to retain this expertise. But I need this. Why? Because when I make my analysis, I need to be able to say, this is what experts have said is the best explanation of the data that we have in hand. And then another part of the SOC, which again, many organizations have this as separate parts. Another function is the notion of self-assessment. The SOC is in a tremendously capable position in order to identify flaws and weaknesses of the information systems that we're trying to defend. The self-assessment function contains things like baselining, vulnerability management, pen testing, development of exercises. This is all stuff that I put in the self-assessment. And this is all the stuff that I think a SOC needs to do. Right? This is the vision that I have for security operations. So within this and across all of these different things, I actually have a set of processes. And I'm going to talk about some of the stuff that I think is important for us to think about. So across these different functions, I actually articulate, when I talk about building SOCs or maintaining SOCs or assessing maturity, I talk about artifacts, inputs, people, processes, and outputs. I'm sorry, I said artifacts first. Inputs, processes, people, the technology in use, and then the outputs coming out of it, which are the artifacts. Okay? And so as I'm thinking through this and talking about my different processes, I assign processes to different groups, and on these processes I'll start to think about how I can orchestrate that. So for orchestration, the sorts of things that I can do in order to orchestrate is basically extract related data from lots of different systems and present that to an analyst. Many analysts have to spend a lot of time just going and getting the data in order to be able to start to do their investigation and start to do their analysis. Now, if you have a tool that's capable of logging into those various systems and extracting that data and presenting it to the analyst, that's a really good opportunity for efficiency. Okay. Another thing that an orchestration tool actually would be really good at is basically saying to the analyst, hey, have you thought about this? Hey, have you thought about that? This is the next step that other analysts have taken when they've done this investigation. Now, the orchestration is not telling the analyst that they have to do it, but the orchestration is helping the analyst to be guided through plausible scenarios in either their investigation or their response. You know, and a scenario might be, hey, you know, this has enough sort of weight to it in terms of the data that I've collected and correlated. Would you like to contain this host? Because if you would like to contain this host, right, by applying it, you know, host-based firewall and a network-based firewall, you can tell this orchestration tool to do that. Now, the orchestration tool would need to go to the network firewall. It would need to change host-based configuration. It might need to do all sorts of other things. Maybe it needs to create tickets in other people's queues in order to do that. Those would all be valuable opportunities for orchestration. Okay? Now, when I think about this, if I'm saying what stuff should I orchestrate, I also want to think about circumstances where I shouldn't orchestrate. What's a bad idea about orchestration? What are reasons why I wouldn't want to do that? Okay? So I'm going to talk about the notion of performance of analysis. I really think that human beings should be the ones that are actually doing the analysis. I think that the tools can help bring the stuff to the human being that human being needs in order to make an intelligent decision. But I don't want to automate the decisions. I want to give the human the information so the human can make the decision. Okay? So that's one circumstance where I don't want to do automation or orchestration, is the actual part of the analysis. Another thing where I don't want to do orchestration and automation is newer complex scenarios. If I haven't figured out how to do it in a simple circumstance, I definitely am not going to strive for orchestration in this very, very complex circumstance. I want to start with little piece parts and then build from there. So don't start with this orchestration across very, very complex circumstances. And another thing is, there's a lot of stuff that we can do in security operations, which is probably actually illegal for us to do. We have the technical capability to do it, but the tools will, on our behalf, commit some problem or commit some crime. Now, the crimes that I'm usually talking about are violations of privacy, violations of data being moved out of a jurisdiction where it's not authorized to be moved, right? But that's a really important reason not to orchestrate. And I'd hate for you to walk out of here and say, hey, he said this was a good idea, and so I'm going to pull the data from over there into this jurisdiction, and now I've just actually set up our company's information systems to do stuff that is going to actually eventually cause a problem for us. That's a huge reason not to orchestrate. Okay? For automation, the idea of this is anything that I'm going to end up needing to do multiple times, I should think about how to automate that. This is like this guiding principle for systems administrators. If I'm going to do it twice, I should think about scripting it, and so I only have to script it once. Okay? And you know, if you walk out of this talk, some of the things that I want you to think about is, I'm going to do this work. Would it be better for me to do this now because someone tells me that there's a hurry? Or would it be better for me to take a little bit of extra time now in order to resolve this, so that the next time that someone comes and says, hey, we're in a hurry, hurry up, I can say, okay, and just basically run my script. And sometimes you can't do that, build the script right at this moment, but you can collect the artifacts of what you actually did so that you can then build that script afterwards. Right? So a little bit of forethought of, I'm going to build this in a way, I'm going to do this in a way that I can build it into some little atom of repetition for later. And I say that, and I assume that most of you agree with me, and yet then you probably have a lot of things that you're thinking, well, I could do it for that, I could do it for that, I could do it for that. And the idea of actually embodying that change is a big challenge for people. Personally, it's usually a challenge to be able to make yourself be disciplined to go and make those changes happen. Breaking off just a little bit of extra time and figuring out ways where you can adapt to that. And it's a hard thing to personally change, but you can do it incrementally and a little bit at a time. So containment actions as an example, and I'm going to come back to lots of specific examples. Containment actions, right, are actually a good example of some things that I would do on the regular basis. I do them often. And actually it's pretty important for me to actually get it just right when I do it. This is a really good example of where I should be automating stuff. Right? If part of what my analyst needs is a memory collection or a file system collection, why am I even having them do that? If all the analysts are going to do it all the time anyway, that's good sort of example stuff for automation. And I do want to mention the paradox of automation, which is the more that you automate, the harder and harder it is for the human being who's supposed to be the safety valve to actually regain control. Okay? And so I have this really kind of scary example. I fly a lot, so I give lots of flight examples. This one was Qantas Flight 72. They're flying along normal cruising altitude, 32,000 feet or wherever they are. And all of a sudden, for no apparent reason, the plane which is an Airbus A350, basically takes a dive, 900, 1,000 feet. Basically nose down, just dives. And after the fact, they figured out that it did this because the computers that were on the plane, there are 3 of them to monitor airspeed and a couple of different things. One of them had actually gone bad. And the reason why there are 3 of them is you're supposed to have consensus between the 2, at least 2, before the plane takes action. Why this one broken computer was allowed to get control, they never really figured out. But in in their forensic analysis afterwards, they said this is what caused the pitch down action. And you had a pilot and a co-pilot basically take the plane off of autopilot and try to get control back, and the entire rest of the flight they were fighting with the plane to try to make sure that they were in control, and there were 2 additional pitch down actions that the plane just did. Right? And that's really scary. Here are the pilots taking the plane off of autopilot, and the plane twice after the first incident just decided I need to drop. Now the plane thought it was stalling. It wasn't stalling, it was flying along normally, but the plane thought it was stalling. And so in order to rectify that, it put the nose down in order to increase airspeed so that it actually had more speed and it would stay aloft. And then you had these pilots trying to land a plane, like bring it really close to the ground and carefully put it on the ground, where the plane occasionally just decides I need to drop a few hundred feet. That's not a plane that any pilot is going to want to land, where they don't control the action of the plane. That is exactly the paradox of automation. How can I be sure that I'm still in control when I don't really have the direct control of the systems anymore? That's what we're afraid of as we automate and automate and automate. Right? And all of you in your daily job, as you think, gee, it would be great if I just pushed the button and it took care of things. If you don't know the details of how that thing ultimately works, when you push the button and it doesn't work, what are you going to do then? Right? That's the problem that we have. So there are certain circumstances that I think is a kind of a contraindication to automation. When I have no clearly defined parameters of accuracy or success, if I can't say this was done exactly right, then it's really hard for me to automate that. Okay? When I don't have my processes already established, I shouldn't be trying to automate those processes. Now, sometimes the opportunity for automation is the incentive to get those processes defined, if this is exactly how we're doing it, and then we can automate that. But still, we need to do that initial part of determining what the process actually is. If I don't have test scenarios for complicated actions, I shouldn't try to automate it, either in the technology itself or in the actions. So I really think that you should have an inventory of processes. Okay, and this is the spreadsheet that I'm talking about. There's the zip file. I haven't put it up there yet. It will be there shortly after the talk. This zip file contains the PowerPoint and this inventory of processes. And I've done this from the perspective of the functional areas. And so it's just a spreadsheet, it's all these different things, but I've got per functional area the processes that I think should be there, as well as a whole bunch of sort of like adjunct kind of things related to just operations. How do you do shift change? What do you do when the person who's supposed to take over the shift for you in the SOC actually didn't show up? Right? How do we handle requests from law enforcement? How do we handle requests from HR? Like all this other stuff that's sort of related. There's all these additional operations. Okay? And so this list is organized in this way. Specificity level, does the process currently exist? If it doesn't exist, when do we think we'll get it created by? And then the priority for automation or orchestration. Okay? And a lot of the rest of this talk I'm going to be talking about what that priority looks like. When I think about building processes, I think about the sequence of how, if someone were to tell me exactly how to walk from this spot out the front door of this hotel. Right? So as a thought exercise for you right now, think about if you had to write down the steps of me following those steps to get me out the front door of this hotel. I would guess that if you wrote them down and I followed them exactly, I'd be like banging into the wall in a couple of minutes, right? I mean, it's like I wouldn't actually be able to follow those steps exactly. Now, if I always follow the steps exactly, as an analyst or as a security operations person, I'm not doing my job well. There's a certain amount of intelligence that I need to bring to the circumstance. But there are some times where we need to tell our staff, hey, you need to do this exactly like this because this is our agreement with the business. And so I actually call this the specificity level. Right? So this specificity level is my direction to the analyst saying, hey, if I tell you exact steps to follow, I really mean exact steps to follow. Okay? But if I tell you general steps or steps plus details or whatever, I expect you to be an intelligent operator and figure out what actually needs to be done in order to get you from here to there. Because y'all are thinking, why do I need to tell you to walk to the front of the hotel? You know how to do that already. Right? So if I'm writing directions for people and I say go out the front door of the hotel or whatever I'm actually telling them to do, if I don't want them to follow my exact steps, I need to be able to communicate that. So identify the processes. I go through. Sometimes it's steps plus details. Sometimes it's exact steps. And then hopefully eventually, and this is another thing that you can download, I actually have a swim lane diagram that shows the relation between some of these processes in my list, between the functional areas showing this is how we work together. This is something that when I try to look at Security Operations Center and start to talk about maturity and capability and sort of things, I say, how do you work? And if people start talking about it and I say, you have a diagram that shows me that? Is there any way, and if they say, oh yeah, we've got this thing, and it actually seems like it's at least reasonably maintained and thought out and is expressive of how they actually work, that usually is indicative to me that they have a greater degree of maturity. If they don't have that stuff, I mean, they probably want it, but they just haven't had the time to be able to get to that, to be able to actually create that. Okay? So as we're building toward automation, sort of a first step is let's get all the processes that we either do or think we do. Whether we've defined how we do it or not, let's get this list. Why? Because then that becomes the repository of, oh, we do this other thing too. Oh, we do this thing too. Right? And we start to build this catalog. And maybe you all have this. Maybe you have a catalog of processes of things that you actually do in your SOC or whatever team you work for. But if you don't, maybe you want to think about like having a repository that everybody knows this is where we store this information. And then part of that list is candidate for automation and orchestration. Right? That's a really important aspect of all the different things that you individually and you as a team do. Like, which are the things that are our biggest pain points? Which are the things that we do all the time that are manual, that it consumes a whole bunch of our effort? Like, those are the things that we start to say, like, oh, everybody says this is a candidate for automation. Okay? So one of the things that I think should not be automated is analysis. And what I mean by analysis is actually best defined by a guy by the name of Richard J. Hauer. Okay, Richard J. Hauer talks about analysis because he is, or was, he's retired, an analyst for the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. Okay? And so he talks about the processes that they use and the methodologies that they use in order to perform analysis. And he says that human beings are actually not at all objective. And he talks about it in this book where he actually defines this. He says human beings tend to jump to conclusions immediately. And then if you give them a little more data, they self-rank themselves as more confident with that more data, but they pretty much just double down on their preconceived notion that they started with. Okay? And he talks about this and the problem associated with it. And he says that as analysts, intelligence analysts, security analysts, we do a lot of things that actually create problems for ourselves. He talks about this sort of inclination to select a solution right away, because this is how our brains have adapted. He says we have problems of selective attention, right? It's actually really hard to pay attention to everything, especially when people are telling me to pay attention to a specific thing. He talks about the fact that analysts actually tend to reason from the principles of their own personal morality. And when they think about the people that are attacking them, like in our context, the security attackers, we don't tend to actually identify the attackers as just people doing a 9-to-5 job just like us. But have you ever thought about the people that are actually attacking our companies? Like, what do they look like? Who are they? What sort of people are they? If you sat down and had dinner with them, would you have a nice conversation with them? And most analysts don't think about that. And why don't they think about that? Because they're tuned to think of these people as bad, morally abhorrent. They're terrible people. But in many cases, they're actually people who are doing a job of some sort. Okay? And he says, if you're trying to come up with an explanation of why somebody does something and you have a preconceived notion of them being this terrible person, that is definitely going to influence the conclusions that you come to about how and why they did stuff. So this is, this is how he's setting up the argument as to why we need this thing he calls the analysis of competing hypotheses. And he says when we do this, we do it only in like complicated circumstances. We do it where we have like no clear parameters of accuracy in the outcome. And we have to then defend our explanations that we come up with. And he says, even if I tell an analyst they have all these problems, them just knowing that it's a problem doesn't fix the problem. So to fix it, we basically externalize this. Okay? So as he's talking about this, he talks about the idea of doing analysis and explains it in a lot more detail that I'm going to explain it tonight. But I have a couple of sort of like summary things of explaining how he does this. He says, this is essentially how you should be making decisions. This is a pretty simple thing. He says, you brainstorm hypotheses, you come up with a matrix, right? So you brainstorm all the different things, you come up with a matrix of the hypotheses that you have, you come up with the data that you have currently, you go and grab more data, you use that data to build out the matrix, and then you refine the matrix and do consolidation of the hypotheses and consolidation of the data and collect more data if that's appropriate. And then you start to do some conclusions. And the way that I tend to do this is I assign 10 points per row. The row is the data element. The points get assigned into the columns of the hypotheses that I think are the best explanations for that particular data element. And what I have just done as an analyst is I have taken my mental machinery and spit it out onto a sheet of paper, and I've externalized the problem. And now other analysts can take the same matrix and interpret the data in their own way, and then we can actually compare what we've come to in terms of a conclusion. Now this is a tremendous amount of extra work in terms of doing the analysis. But I ask analysts in SOCs, I ask them, literally, what is your methodology of doing analysis? And they usually start showing me how they collect data and all this other. And I'm like, no, that's not what I'm asking you. I don't care about how you gather data. How do you think? How do you come to conclusions? How do you defend that mental process of connections that your brain is making for any number of different reasons? Okay, and so the reason why Richards J. Howard wrote this is because they had analysts in the Central Intelligence Agency that were coming to conclusions, and then they couldn't actually explain why. So they needed some methodology to be able to articulate that in an external form Take it out of your brain and express it. Okay? And so the idea of this sort of work being done in an automated fashion, there are parts that I can automate around this to make this faster, but that thinking, that analytical components, I still want the person doing it. There are some scenarios where I could talk about sort of machine learning type techniques, running scenario type techniques in order to hypothesize all these different potential outcomes and then use probability and statistics in order to express that. Maybe we'll get there next year, right? But for now in security operations centers, this part of this, like, you're not there yet. It's way too complex, okay? So for the time being, we're going to have human beings doing this work. Now, all of the stuff of like pulling things together for the human to do the work, I'll talk about automation related to that. Howard says, take this output, and then you're going to look at it critically, and you're going to determine the elements that actually weigh most heavily on your hypothesis selection. Okay? Now, this is sort of a simple example. You can see it there, but you can basically see that I have this one row where there's heavily weighted in one particular solution. And then, and even if I have multiples of these, I say, what if that was wrong? Right? Can I go and get more data related to that? What if that is factually inaccurate, even though it seems like at the moment we think it's right? How does that affect my outcome? How does that affect my conclusion? Now, when I challenge people to do this initially, sort of like the first time, first of all, they hate it because it takes so much longer than their normal methodology. But the other thing is when I start saying, well, what if that data's wrong? A lot of times people resist this. And they say, well, the data's not wrong. Like, the data doesn't lie, Chris. That's not wrong. It's in the log or whatever. It's like, that's not at all the point. The point is your understanding of how your conclusion depends on that piece of information. Right? And if that was wrong for any number of reasons, hypothetically, how that affects your outcome, then you have to reconsider what you're doing. And this is fascinating. When you start to apply this sort of rigor in your decisions about explaining stuff to people, all of a sudden, you have, you have sort of this circumstance of, wow, like I don't really know how I got to this conclusion. So, you take your conclusions, report them out, provide that to people. They'll ask you questions. You potentially, get those sort of things. But this also then becomes a very mature sort of perspective of, I can say to the people who I'm giving the report to, I have considered all of these different possibilities, and this is the one that I think is the weighted, most probable explanation, right? That's a very mature sort of depiction of our work. Otherwise, it's just, that's what the analyst thinks. Okay? And if the analyst is right, you probably actually can predict some things that will probably happen in the future using sort of milestones and depictions. And another thing that I say that's actually really important from the reporting is before you send this to anybody outside of the SOC, make sure somebody else in the SOC who didn't write the report read it. Okay. In my experience, most security analysts are terrible writers. Right? And they tend to talk all about bits and bytes without actually expressing the rationale and the thought and the business relevance and so on. So people who are focused on computers tend not to craft themselves as good articulate writers. Why? Because it's not necessary for being good at computers. But actually, as it turns out, it is exactly the product that you are outputting. It is exactly it. It is the communication to other people about the security aspects of what you're seeing that's really important. And in fact, the whole reason why there is a SOC. So this ACH process, this is something that as a sequence is really important. There are parts of this that we can orchestrate. There are parts of it I don't want to automate. Okay? So One fear that I have when I start to build out pre-created analysis of competing hypotheses templates is I'm going to give these to my analysts in the SOC in order to expedite things and make it easier for them, and they're going to take this template and just fill in the boxes. They're like, I'm done, there you go. Which is exactly not the point. The point is it's a thinking tool, right? It's a thing that is not limiting, it is helping you to get to the analysis more quickly, but you can still do that brainstorming and expansion. Okay, so this is sort of one of the dangers with pre-building these templates. However, I really think you should pre-build these templates. I really do. And give them to your analysts. The stuff that you encounter frequently, like spend one session with 10 analysts to do the brainstorming. Like, what are all the sort of things that you actually have? And as it turns out, you kind of don't even need to do that. Go look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Right? I mean, there's lots of things that are available inside of that to explain the circumstances of what you have. I still want you to do this internal templating, but I think that the MITRE ATT&CK framework is a really rich source of inspiration for your brainstorming. Okay? And then, looking back at this, actually there are a lot of piece parts that can be automated of bringing things into me. But just don't try to automate that analytical part. So going back to my list, this Excel spreadsheet of all the different processes that I talked about, okay, I'm going to sort of focus on your decision making and explain to you how I came up with my prioritization for automation and orchestration. Because that's way more important than my list and my interpretation of my list. It's me sharing my thought process, my methodology with you in terms of how I'm approaching this particular problem. So my suggested thing is to take this list, and if you want to modify it, you know, your stuff, that's great, that's even better, and then look for the places where there's exact steps to follow. If you're telling an analyst you have to do this exactly this way for whatever reason, that's a really good candidate for orchestration automation. Okay? And then I would put that in either moderate or highest in terms of priority. And it needs to be a task that is done frequently and a task that has minimal tolerance for error for it to achieve the highest ranking. Okay? What are some poor candidates? Well, poor candidates are the things that are general steps. Like if you've gone through the list and done this honestly and you have stuff where it's general steps and I expect the analyst to think about it and figure out, it's probably not ready for orchestration automation. Now, I'd put that as sort of the lowest and none. And for the nones, in order to qualify for the very lowest ranking, right? For the nones, I'd say it's a human action that doesn't warrant orchestration because specifically the act of collecting the data or doing whatever the action is actually has value for the analyst in learning about it. So as an example, you have a host that you've never performed investigation on previously. Are you going to just take your automated script and drop it on there and run it? Yeah, I mean, maybe, but I also want the analyst to double check that script of all the stuff that it's doing because we've never looked at this host before, and the host or the host type is new and novel to us. Okay? So this sort of stuff where we have value in the performance because the act itself actually teaches the analyst something is why we get to the lowest tier. Okay? So little reminder, steering committee, command center, network security monitoring, threat intelligence, incident response, forensics, and self-assessment are my different areas. So let's talk about a few examples of this in each of these different functions. In terms of the steering committee, in my assessment, basically most of the stuff in the steering committee is none and lowest. Why? Because it's about human beings deciding the right stuff. Now, I can basically provide metrics in a report that I've got automation for providing the metrics, but I want somebody reviewing those metrics, right? I'm creating them because I want a human being to interpret them. Okay. In terms of command center, they're actually I tried to find sort of a highest sort of one for each area. So for command center, the idea of impact assessment, Here, I have some components for this. HR interactions, some components for this. Right? In terms of network security monitoring, my exact steps to follow is validate receipt of data sources. Validate receipt of data sources. What do I mean by that? Your SOC has a whole bunch of different places where it's getting data. You should absolutely know if any of that goes away. And I do not want a human being spending their time checking to see if there's the right amount of data coming in from all the different data sources. But what's terrible about this is actually one of the things that happens on an ongoing basis to our SOC is we stop getting feeds from all the different systems. Why? Right? There are all sorts of different reasons why it happens, but the awareness of it and the detection of it should be part of our automation. Okay. In terms of threat intelligence, the thing that I think should be automated is the enrichment of data into my SIM with threat intelligence. Okay? The actual movement of the data into the SIM with the enrichment, I think, is the highest component. Things like naming intrusion sets or doing correlation, I think, are lower priorities to do this. Incident response. All of my containment actions, all of the things that I can trigger as a containment, host-based firewall, disable VPN account, put in a network-based firewall, all that stuff, I should have a monitoring analyst being able to say, I submit this system for containment, and boom, 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 boom. The changes that I'm authorized to do for containment happen. And maybe I'm not quite there yet where I can orchestrate across all sorts of systems. At least say contain this, and it creates the tickets in the different people's queues to do that. And I can virtually guarantee that any of you that actually work in the SOC are still creating tickets for people to do stuff for things like containment actions. Why? Because we haven't prioritized that away from you as just to contain. And whatever the underlying actions that have to happen for the containment, you shouldn't have to do that. Because it's pretty straightforward. We're going to do basically the same thing the same way. And so in terms of this, for self-assessment, I have some examples here. This one, vulnerability scanning. The vulnerability scan itself, right? I'm putting this as sort of a moderate action because I don't think that this is something that we do enough coming out of the SOC that really justifies making it highest. There are also maybe some things that are specific that the analyst can learn as they're doing this. So these are some of my rationales and thoughts in terms of how I do this, and I've cherry-picked a couple of examples out of my process list. That process list is 100 processes long or so, and so I would be interested, for those of you who actually start doing this and approaching this, if you are authorized to, and only if you're authorized to, I would be interested if you change that list. If you can share it back with me, I'd be interested to hear what that looks like. Okay. So, this point, I want to ask you